Belgium is a nation, not a road. The man who would come to be known as King Albert I of Belgium was born April 8th, 1875, in Brussels, Belgium. He was the second eldest son of Prince Philippe, Count of Flanders, and Princess Maria of Hohenzollern. His grandfather was Leopold I, the first king of the Belgians, and the head of House Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His uncle was King Leopold II, the original man in control of the Congo Free State, who caused the Belgian government to take actual control of the Congo. But for Albert, life was simple. He was the son of the first in line to the throne when his cousin, the king's son, died. But still ahead of him was his elder brother, Bourdon. But unfortunately, soon he would die as well. And Albert was now 16 and was the second in line for the throne after his father. Now, he now began to train in the Constitution of Belgium and his future post as king of the Belgians. He began to school himself in the working class, going on constant tours of Belgium, and even taking a grand tour of the Belgian Congo. Like I said before, the Congo was meant originally as the personal property of Leopold II. But when the Belgian government received reports of the atrocities taking place, they formally annexed it as Belgian colonial holdings. But while becoming at first the people's king, he also got married. Albert was a devout Roman Catholic, and as the head of Belgium, a Catholic nation, it had to be someone of Catholic faith. But someone he loved so on October 2nd, 1900. Albert married the Duchess Elizabeth of Bavaria in Munich. Bavaria was one of the few German principalities to not be Lutheran or other form of Protestantism. This one isn't anything new since Albert's own mother, Maria, was the member of the Catholic sect of the Kaiser's family of Hohenzollern. The couple was well received by the people of Belgium. Now, this is time to discuss the demographics of Belgium. Belgium itself was created mainly via a buffer state between France and the Netherlands. So it was made up of mainly French, Dutch, Germans, and Flemish people. So this didn't make him marry Elizabeth a problem, the same way it would in a place like Germany or England. The young couple would have 3 children together, but on December 17th, 1909, Albert's life of training finally came to use. His uncle, King Leopold II, died of pneumonia. Now Albert's father died in 1905, leaving him as the successor to the throne. On December 23rd, Albert took his oath of office as king in Brussels. Now, usually they did the oath in French, as the majority of their citizens were French culturally. But for once, he as king gave his oath also in Dutch, which no king had done before. Now, the royal family was extremely beloved throughout Belgium for their frugality and normality. In a period during the rise of socialism and outright revolt against authority, the frugal life and normal lives the king and his family lived in brought respect and admiration to the king from his people. In the summer of 1910, he and many of his cousins would be summoned to London, following the death of his cousin, King Edward VII. While here, an extremely famous picture will be taken of the 9 European monarchs. Now, in this point, I'd like to point out, of all people, Albert in the picture. Now, for years, things had been getting heated in Europe, especially in Germany, following the dismissal of Otto von Bismarck as Chancellor, who many credit as the man who kept the great European game balanced for so long. Albert's face in this picture, though, says a lot, as if foreshadowing the conflict that would soon arrive from his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, was gunned down in Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. Now began the July Crisis, in which many nations began to threaten one another with war. Albert was always the peacekeeper, wanting to stop war before it got bad. However, when Tsar Nicholas II began a general mobilization, it was then that Germany and Austria would declare war on Russia. But because Russia had become allies in recent years with France, they decided to join the fray to defend their eastern allies. Now, Germany for some time had been planning something for this exact situation, and it was called the Schlieffen Plan. The plan was how Germany would be able to quickly win. The Schlieffen Plan was that the German army would strike hard through the Ardennes forest into France and take Paris. Then once France capitulated, the Germans would move their forces east to defeat Russia. But the most important part of the offensive was strictly on one place: Belgium. Now, the Kaiser believed that Belgium would allow German troops to cross through without any opposition. But Albert, speaking on behalf of his government, said, "Belgium is a nation, not a road." So Belgium denied German cooperation, which he thought probably would derail the war in general, specifically because the British were allies with Belgium, so an attack on Belgium would then bring England into the war. Plus, the king was the Kaiser's cousin. But chief of the German army, Helmuth von Moltke, the Younger, drew out the options, and to win the war, they must cross through Belgium. So on August 4th, 1914, forces commanded by Alexander von Kluck and Karl von Bülow crossed into the kingdom's borders. Without missing a beat, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany, which they had been quietly preparing for since the outbreak of the July Crisis. Albert, as the king, was put in supreme command of all Belgian forces for the defense of the kingdom. Now, he knew he would not be able to stop the larger, industrialized German imperial army, so he and his generals could only perform delaying actions until the Anglo-French forces could move in to aid. General Joffre and his 5th French Army was en route, while a coalition of Anglo-French soldiers commanded by General Sir John French of the British Army had landed and were making their way towards the front to halt the Germans. So Albert's options were not broad. He could fight and delay, or do nothing and capitulate. He decided to stand his ground and fight. At the Battle of Hallen, the Belgians held back the Germans on August 12, 1914, but the victory was bitter, as at the Battle of Liege, that had been raging since the 5th, would end on August 14th in a Belgian defeat. From the 20th to 25th of August, the Germans would besiege Namur. Again, Albert's expectations were not in victory, but in delaying. On September 28th, the siege of Antwerp began. Here Albert would personally command the Belgian forces, along with allied British troops. But the city would also fall. The king and the majority of the Belgian troops withdrew across the Yers River. Meanwhile, 30,000 troops were interred in the Netherlands, which had remained neutral. Albert, however, now lost the largest city in Belgium and was fortifying across the River Yers. Now, for those of you who don't know Belgium's northwest territory, it's not very necessarily boggy, but it has a lot of waterways, dams, sluices, and dike systems. So with only 5% of his nation under his control, and refusing to flee to England, Albert I ordered the Yers River flooded, and with it, the Flanders region. Now Flanders became a giant water-soaked mess of mud and swamps. Albert, at this point, refused to flee or become a monarch in exile. Donning a trench coat and a Belgian Mauser, he joined his soldiers, fighting them, shoulder to shoulder, against the German army. On October 16th, Albert, Duke and Crown Prince of Württemberg, and General Hans von Bessler began the Battle of Yers. But in a larger sense, something even greater had begun. In history, we refer to this as the Race to the Sea. Now, the German plan was, after their defeat at the Marne, outside Paris, they would strike hard, dislodging the Belgian and Anglo-French forces from the north, so they could cave the Allied defenses back to Paris, subsequently giving the Germans the chance to strike hard towards Paris and take the city. This was the Germans' last chance to have the Schlieffen Plan come through. But at the Battle of Years, the Belgians proved themselves. They held back waves of Germans for a few days, but were soon becoming overrun by the Imperial troops. So late on the night of October 25th, Belgians opened the sluices at Nieuwpoort. Now, though the Germans would go on to push the Belgians to their second line of defense, they also slowly began to realize that the position behind them were becoming impassable and flooded, and that they would soon be trapped. And the Franco-Belgian forces had already mounted successful counterattacks. Though the Battle of Years would end on October 30th, it would become a greater battle when the Germans' attack at Ypres began. The action would be from October 19th to November 22nd and end indecisively. But in a greater sense, it was a Belgian victory. Though many had died, King Albert and his men held their ground against the waves of Imperial German army. For the next 4 years, Albert and his army would remain entrenched on the Yers River. He even allowed his 12-year-old heir and son, Prince Leopold, to enlist as a private in the Belgian army. His main job was to deliver information from the front to officers in the rear. But through the 4 years, Albert fought side by side with his soldiers, unlike other monarchs. No offense to men like George V, Wilhelm II, or even the Tsar, Nicholas II. At the Fifth Battle of Ypres, he would lead the Grand Groupe d'Armées des Flandres, a coalition force of French, Belgian, and British troops. The plan was in response to the failed German offensive of 1918. The Allies had figured out that the German army was very thin, and the offensive was their last chance at ending the war. So the plan was to begin the end for the Germans, and King Albert given the reins of the army group. The Fifth Battle of Ypres, which was part of Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch's 100-day offensive, would begin on September 28th, 1918. And it would end on October 2nd, 1918, with an Allied victory. On November 11th, 1918, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. The king would re-enter Brussels on horseback with his family, like Caesar returning to Rome triumphantly. Now, Belgium had become somewhat of a rallying call for the Allied cause. What happened in German-occupied Belgium became known as Voix de la Belgique, or in English, the Rape of Belgium. But Albert wanted to be sure the war was recognized as what it was: great governments of Europe having childish response to a tragedy. He spoke for fair and not harsh terms on the new German government, and the great hope was that Belgium, who was the most abused nation, that their opinions of forgiveness and redemption would be understood. King Albert himself approached the Big Four: Lloyd George of England, Wilson of the United States, Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy, begging them to give fair terms and do not do as the Germans had done to Belgium at the beginning of the war, or France after the Franco-Prussian War. President Wilson actually agreed with the king, but the other three nations, who had fought all the years of the war against the Germans, were not as forgiving. He did not support the terms of the Versailles Treaty, again predicting the horrors that would come from it. But after the war, he was an international hero, earned the titles of the Knight King or the Soldier King for his bravery and courage for not fleeing at the bleakest moment. Following the retaking of Belgium and the end of the war, Albert would call lead members of government to Lopum Castle in West Flanders, where he began to discuss progressive changes to Belgium, including mass military reform, universal suffrage, and the establishment of the first Flemish university in Belgium. Now, Catholic conservatives believe this to be a, so to speak, coup d'etat being held by the liberals and socialists, because they the king feared something like the socialist revolution in Germany would happen in Belgium. But the king would go on to write an open letter to the government stating that he had not been pressured, and in fact he wanted these things for years, including during the war. The king and his wife would go to the United States in the fall of 1919. While on the visit, he would award a Catholic missionary the Order of Leopold for his service amongst the Native American tribes. But he also received an honorary degree from Columbia University in New York. The trip was refreshing to Americans to see a man seen as a hero of the war and world do a tour across their country. It's also at this time universal suffrage finally came in. Now, it wasn't universal, but universal male suffrage. A right that never existed in Belgium before. Belgium used to be more similar to the Roman Republic, that the political class was chosen by the wealthy. But then with this, all men, regardless of race, class, or political belief, got the vote. Also in 1920, he would officially change the name of the Royal House of Belgium. Like I said earlier, his grandfather, Leopold I, was the founding king of Belgium. But the head of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which by the time of World War I had been connected to every royal house in Europe. But due to anti-German sentiments during the war, many royal houses, like the English, changed their name. So Albert in 1920 became the founder of the House of Belgium. He did this in a symbolic way of repairing the damage the Germans had committed. But he was also extremely active in Belgian Reconstruction, including paying much personally for the repairs to their torn country. But it wasn't only Belgium he wanted to improve. Albert, as we discussed earlier, was a critic of imperialism. He had toured the Congo Free State and wished to make amends for the action of his uncle during the Congo Free State. So he started by pursuing reforms in the colonial administration and even establishing at the African continent's first national park, at Virunga National Park. Albert was the king the world now looked to, the peaceful warrior in the peace following the war. But Albert wanted to do his own peace, and he had become somewhat of an active mountain climber. So on February 17th, 1937, Albert went solo rock climbing at Mars-les-Dames in Namur, Belgium. It was an early morning climb, as because of his duties as king, he had a meeting later at the Palace des Sports. He would nod to his valet and then begin the climb. Hours would pass and the valet would not see the king or anything or of anyone else present. Upon getting a group of volunteers, the king's body was discovered at the base of the mountain. The side of his head was caved in, and he had been dead for hours. The news broke of the king's death, and his son Leopold would take the oath of office a few days later. Conspiracies immediately began to rise, stating the king, an experienced alpinist, could not have fallen and died in such a way. In 2016, however, a new study was done by Flemish researchers that confirmed that it had most definitely been a simple climbing accident. But in 1937, officially, Albert the Good is gone. He would be laid to rest in the royal crypt in the church of Our Lady of Laeken. King Albert I was a warrior king, but also an enlightened one. When given the chance to flee, he said no. Instead, he donned a trench coat, Adrien helmet, Belgian Mauser, and instead of the comforts of a palace, he slept in trenches. He is memorialized in many places, but I thought the most important example would be the one at the Royal Library of Brussels in the capital of Belgium. He was on horseback with his helmet removed, symbolizing his life as a soldier and his defense of Belgium, but in a deeper sense, that his heart wasn't that of a warrior, but of an enlightened leader. Thanks for watching. I feel Albert I was an extremely important character in world history. He was more mourned than George V or either of his sons when they died, and I believe he doesn't get the recognition he deserves. Thanks as always for joining us. If you're a returning friend to our channel, please like, share, and comment. If we're new to the channel, I invite you to subscribe. I have new content daily, and we'd love to have more folks to join our ever-growing community of history lovers. Thanks again, and see you real soon.